In New Haven, Connecticut, in the years just before the Civil War arrived to change everything, there was a particular quality to the social world of the city's educated families, a formality that nevertheless contained genuine warmth, a sense that learning and refinement were visible achievements worth cultivating and displaying. The parlors of the city's better households were furnished with care. Conversation moved in French as readily as English among those who had been educated to manage both. Latin was not merely a clerical language, but a mark of serious intellectual formation, a thing a well-schooled person carried the way they carried a sense of proportion into this world and into the particular stratum of it that could be called accomplished. Sarah Pardee arrived as one of its more notable members. She was born on September 14th, 1839, the fourth of 7 children in the family of Leonard Pardee, a carriage maker whose business placed the family comfortably within New Haven's prosperous middle class. The education she received went considerably further than what was common for women of her generation. She was documented as fluent in French, Italian, and Latin, 3 languages beyond her own, and her facility with music was described in contemporary accounts as genuinely practiced rather than merely ornamental. In the social vocabulary of the 1850s and early 1860s in New Haven, the phrase that attached itself to her was one of the more pointed compliments available. She was called the Belle of New Haven, a designation that contained in its few syllables not only the observation that she was beautiful and socially compelling, but the recognition that she was also, in the estimation of those around her, something more than that. The city itself was in those years a place of layered meanings. Yale College sat at its center. The Long Wharf extended into New Haven Harbor, where commercial traffic moved in and out with the regularity of a working port. And not far from the harbor, on the western side of the city, a factory was producing things that would eventually reach all the way to the farthest edges of the continent and return in the form of wealth that would touch nearly everyone of consequence in the city. The New Haven Arms Company manufactured repeating rifles. Its products were precise and effective, and increasingly in demand. The family that held a significant stake in that enterprise was the Winchester family, and the eldest son of Oliver Fisher Winchester, the company's dominant figure, was a young man named William Wirt Winchester. Sarah Pardee and William Winchester were married on September 30th, 1862, in a ceremony that brought together 2 of New Haven's prominent households. The Civil War had been underway for more than a year by then. The Henry repeating rifle that would make the Winchester fortune more secure than it had ever been was already in production, already moving toward the battlefields, where its advantages over single-shot weapons would make it a thing soldiers wrote home about. None of this was the texture of a wedding day, perhaps, but it was the texture of the city and the season, the particular historical moment in which 2 people joined their lives in a New Haven parlor. Sarah Pardee became Sarah Winchester on that September afternoon. She was 22 years old, widely regarded as one of the most accomplished young women her social world had produced, and the life she was beginning carried all the ordinary complexity of lives at their beginning, possibility and uncertainty held together in the same moment, neither one yet dominant. The years that followed were the years of building, not the construction that would come later in California, the building that the world would eventually find strange and inexhaustible. These were the years of building a marriage, a household, a place in the social fabric of a prosperous New England city. William Winchester was a man of his era and his class, industrious, connected to his family's enterprise, moving within the circles that his father's wealth and position made available. Sarah moved within them beside him, managing the social obligations of a household that occupied a position in New Haven society, exercising the multilingual fluency and the social intelligence that had distinguished her before marriage, and that continued to distinguish her after it. The loss, when it came, was the kind that leaves no external mark. On June 15th, 1866, Sarah Winchester gave birth to a daughter. The child was named Annie Pardee Winchester, taking her mother's maiden name as a middle name in the way of the period. A thread of continuity woven into the naming. Annie lived for 40 days. She died on July 25th, 1866, from marasmus, a severe form of protein energy malnutrition, a failure of the infant body to take in and hold the nourishment it needed to go on. The medical understanding of the condition in 1866 was limited. The interventions available were few, and the death of infants, however much it diminished with each passing decade of the 19th century, was still a thing that happened, still a thing families endured, still a weight that settled into households and remained. 40 days is a particular span of time. It is longer than a month, long enough for a family to have begun to organize itself around the new person, to have named her and held her, and let the fact of her presence enter the rhythm of daily life. It is not long enough for much else. The summer in New Haven in 1866 would have been warm and ordinary in the way that summers in Connecticut are warm and ordinary. The harbor active, the Yale campus quiet in its long vacation, the parlors of the city's households open to the season's light. The summer had barely settled into itself before Annie Pardee Winchester was gone. The season continued. The world outside the Winchester household continued. Inside it, something had changed that would not change back. Sarah was 26 years old when her daughter died. William was not yet 30. They were, by every external measure, people at the beginning of their lives together, in possession of all the resources that the Winchester connection provided, in possession also of each other, which was not nothing. The grief was real, and it settled in, and the household went on around it in the way that households do. There were no more children. The nursery, wherever it was in the Winchester house on Prospect Street, was the room that had been prepared and then not needed, and then simply stood. The 1870s passed. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company produced rifles in quantities that translated steadily into the fortune that William stood to inherit and that Sarah stood beside. Oliver Fisher Winchester, William's father, was in those years building the company into one of the most significant arms manufacturers in America, the Model 1866 and then the Model 1873, reaching into markets that spread from the American frontier to the armies of foreign governments. The Winchester name was becoming something larger than a family name, acquiring the particular resonance of a brand that had attached itself to an era. All of this was in the background of a marriage in New Haven, the background of a household where a woman who had once been called the Belle of New Haven was moving through her 30s. Then, in the winter of 1880 and into the spring of 1881, William Winchester began to die. Pulmonary tuberculosis was in the 19th century a disease that moved at its own pace, sometimes swift, sometimes prolonged, its progress marked by the particular cadence of a declining respiratory system, the cough deepening, the breath shortening, the body's stores of resilience being drawn down over weeks and months. William Wirt Winchester was 43 years old. He had been born in 1837, had grown up in his father's household during the years when Oliver Winchester was consolidating the fortune that would define the family, had married Sarah Pardee in 1862, and had spent the nearly 20 years since living within the social and financial world the Winchester enterprise created. He died on March 7, 1881. The New Haven house on Prospect Street was not a small place, and it was not an empty one in the sense of being without furnishings or staff, or the ordinary materials of a well-maintained household. But Sarah Winchester was 41 years old, and she was now alone in it, in the way that widows are alone. The particular solitude of a person whose daily life has been organized around another person's presence, and now no longer is. She had no children. Both her parents were gone. Her sister Mary was alive, and the Party family remained connected to her life, but the household that had been hers and William's was now hers alone, and the silence that had entered it 15 years earlier with the death of Annie Party Winchester had found no subsequent voice to fill it. The estate that William's death transferred to Sarah was by any standard of the day extraordinary. The figure recorded in the historical accounts is approximately $20 million, a number that requires some reckoning to fully hold, given that this was 1881, before inflation had compressed the distances between the dollar values of different eras. A household in respectable New Haven comfort in that period might have managed on several $100s a year. $20 million was the kind of wealth that required management, that generated further wealth through dividends and investments, that made the question of what a person would do with their life genuinely open in a way it is not open for people constrained by ordinary resources. Alongside the cash and properties and investments, Sarah held a nearly 50% stake in the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. The company's products were selling in numbers that translated into an income estimated by various accounts at approximately $1,000 per day, every day, continuing without interruption. She was one of the wealthiest women in the United States. She was 41 years old. She had outlived her only child and her husband. She was fluent in 3 languages and had been raised to a social intelligence that expressed itself most naturally in company, in conversation, in the management of a household that received guests, in the cultivation of a social life that gave her accomplishments an audience and a purpose. All of that remained in the abstract. In the concrete, she was a widow in a New Haven house with rooms she moved through alone, and the season was still winter, and the question of what came next was simply there, unanswered. It was sometime in the early 1880s, in the period after William's death, when Sarah was still in New England, that she reportedly made her way to Boston and consulted a medium named Adam Coons. The account that has circulated most widely in the popular telling of Sarah Winchester's story describes this consultation as transformative, as the moment when Sarah was told, or came to understand, that the spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles were following her, and that the only protection available to her was to move west and build, ceaselessly, a house that the spirits could inhabit and be placated by. This is the narrative that has attached itself most firmly to the Winchester Mystery House, the story that has been printed in tourist brochures and repeated in documentary films and told to visitors standing in the switchback staircase corridor in San Jose. The difficulty is that historians who have worked through the documentary record, including Robert Svihas, who has examined the primary sources most carefully, have found no credible contemporary evidence that supports this account in any of its specific details. No newspaper from the period describes the meeting with Adam Coons. No letter from Sarah Winchester refers to it. No document produced during her lifetime connects her building activity to spirit instruction or ghost appeasement. The account appears in the documentary record to have been constructed and circulated after Sarah's death, in the years when the house was being transformed from a private estate into a public attraction. The bones of it may rest on something real. Sarah may well have consulted a medium, which would have been an entirely respectable thing for a grieving widow to do in the 1880s, when American spiritualism was at the height of its cultural influence. But the specific details of the story, as it has been popularized, do not survive contact with the available primary evidence. This uncertainty is worth holding carefully, not because it diminishes anything, but because it clarifies something. Whatever moved Sarah Winchester to leave New Haven, it moved her. Whatever drew her westward toward California, it drew her. The question of whether that movement was driven by medium instruction, or grief, or a widow's desire for a different kind of life, or some combination of all three, is a genuinely open question, and open questions held honestly are more interesting than resolved ones. The fact that the most dramatic version of the story cannot be verified does not make the story less worth following. It makes the following more careful, more attentive to what the record actually holds. In 1884, Sarah Winchester arrived in the Santa Clara Valley of California. She had traveled across the country, which in 1884 meant traveling by rail. The Transcontinental Railroad having been complete for 15 years by then. The journey from New Haven to California reduced from months to days. The landscape of the continent unrolling past the windows of a Pullman car in a way that must have made the scale of the country physically felt rather than merely known. She would have passed through New York, then across the Ohio Valley and the Missouri River, then across the plains and the high deserts and the mountain ranges, and then down into the Sacramento Valley, and finally into the warmth of the Santa Clara Valley, where the land was flat and agricultural, and the light came in at a different angle than it did in Connecticut. The Santa Clara Valley, in 1884, was not yet the place it would become. San Jose was a small city, its center compact, its edges giving way quickly to orchards and farmland. The valley was known for its agricultural productivity, fruits and grains and vegetables grown in the mild climate, and sold into the markets of San Francisco and beyond. It was not a place of particular distinction, not a fashionable destination, not the kind of location a woman of means and social standing from New Haven would naturally have found herself. It was simply a place of open land and mild weather, and a certain agricultural quietness, a place that was not New Haven, not the industrial Northeast, not the household on Prospect Street with its rooms and its history and its weight. Sarah purchased the property from a man named Dr. Robert Caldwell. The price she paid was approximately $12,500, a figure that gives some sense of what the land and the building on it were worth in that market at that moment, and that represents, given her resources, something close to a trivial expenditure. What she acquired for that price was an 8-room farmhouse on 161 acres of Santa Clara Valley agricultural land. The house was unfinished, for it sat on its acreage in the mild California climate without particular distinction, a farmhouse of the sort that the valley contained many of, a starting point rather than a destination, a structure that a person with ordinary resources might have furnished and lived in as it stood, without modification, without expansion, without the workforce and the daily activity that would eventually transform it into something that the world would find difficult to account for. But that transformation had not begun yet. The workers had not been hired. The plans had not been drawn. The lumber had not been ordered. The hammers were not yet sounding. The house sat on its 161 acres, in whatever particular quality of light the Santa Clara Valley offered in those weeks in 1884, 8 rooms and an unfinished structure, and a stretch of flat agricultural California extending in every direction. Sarah Winchester had arrived in a new place, in a new part of the country, in a new phase of whatever her life was going to be. She was 44 years old. She had been a daughter in a New Haven household, educated to a standard unusual for women of her era. She had been a wife in a Winchester household, moving through the social world that the family's wealth and position created. She had been a mother for 40 days to a child who died in the summer of 1866. She had been a widow since March 7th, 1881, managing an estate of $20 million and a nearly 50% stake in one of the most productive arms manufacturers in the country. She had been a traveler, moving by rail across the full width of the continent to a valley she had not known before. She was now, in whatever sense the word applies, a Californian, standing somewhere on 161 acres of Santa Clara Valley farmland, with an 8-room unfinished house in front of her, and the resources had she wanted to use them to do almost anything. The 8 rooms sat quietly. The valley extended around them in the California afternoon. There was nothing about the farmhouse that announced what it would become. There was nothing in the view from its windows that suggested anything other than the ordinary flatness of agricultural land, the ordinary quality of Northern California light, the ordinary silence of a place between things, between the life that had been and whatever was coming next. The most extraordinary private residence ever constructed in American history was, in that moment, simply a farmhouse in the Santa Clara Valley, unfinished, on 161 acres, waiting in the particular stillness of a place where the next chapter has not yet arrived. The California light would have moved across the farmhouse in the way that light moves across structures in open country, evenly, without the mediation of taller buildings on either side, the sun tracking its arc across a sky that in the Santa Clara Valley offers it room to be seen. The 8 rooms inside held whatever Dr. Caldwell had left and whatever Sarah had brought with her, and the 161 acres outside held the flat agricultural land that the valley specializes in, and the distance between where Sarah Winchester had come from and where she was standing in 1884 was not only the width of a continent, but the length of a life that had moved through New Haven's parlors, and New Haven's losses, and New Haven's silence to arrive. Finally, here, in the warmth and the openness of a California valley that had no memory of her and no expectations for her, and no particular weight of the past attached to it. That stillness, the stillness of a place and a life in the moment just before something begins, is a particular kind of stillness. It is not the stillness of having arrived, not the stillness of completion or rest. It is the stillness of a breath held, a moment balanced between what has been and what will be. The farmhouse on 161 acres of Santa Clara Valley land held that stillness in the autumn of 1884, and Sarah Winchester stood somewhere in or near it, and the California light moved across the roof and the walls and the unfinished edges of a structure that was for now simply 8 rooms in a quiet valley, sitting in the warmth, waiting. In the autumn of 1866, workers at the New Haven Arms Company factory in Connecticut were assembling repeating rifles in quantities that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The building smelled of machine oil and freshly cut metal. The sound inside was the sound of mechanisms being fitted, lever-action components seated into wooden stocks, cartridge guides checked for tolerance, finished rifles moving down the line and into crates addressed to buyers across a country that had just finished fighting itself. The Civil War had ended the year before, and the market for repeating firearms had not contracted with the peace. It had expanded. The Henry repeating rifle, which had performed with enough distinction on Union battlefields to generate substantial commercial attention was the foundation on which a new and larger enterprise was being prepared. Oliver Fisher Winchester understood what the Henry rifle's battlefield record had demonstrated. A soldier carrying a Henry repeating rifle could sustain a rate of fire that made every soldier carrying it worth several soldiers carrying a single-shot weapon. That was not a claim that required dramatization. It was an arithmetic fact that had been observed in practice, reported by officers, noted in dispatches, and translated with reasonable efficiency into civilian demand once the war had concluded. Winchester recognized that the New Haven Arms Company, which had manufactured the Henry, was sitting on a reputation that could support a reorganized and more ambitiously capitalized enterprise. In 1866, he reorganized the company and renamed it the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, building on everything the Henry had established while preparing to go considerably further. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company arrived in the American market at a moment when the American continent was being crossed, settled, contested, and transformed with a speed that earlier generations would not have recognized. The Western territories were not empty. They were inhabited by peoples who had lived there for generations, in some cases for centuries, and the processes by which those peoples were being displaced were violent, sustained, and industrially supported in ways that the records of the period document plainly. Firearms were central to that displacement. The rifles produced in New Haven, Connecticut in the late 1860s and through the 1870s were among the weapons that made it possible. That is what the records establish. It is not a separate fact from the commercial history of the Winchester Company. It is continuous with it. The Model 1873 lever-action repeating rifle arrived into this landscape with a combination of engineering and commercial intelligence that made it, over the years that followed, one of the most widely distributed firearms in the American West. Over 720,000 units were manufactured before the model's production eventually ended. The number itself requires a moment to settle. More than 720,000 individual rifles, each one assembled in New Haven, each one chambered to fire a cartridge that matched the round used by the Colt revolver. A deliberate engineering decision that meant a man carrying both weapons needed to carry only one type of ammunition. That practical interchangeability was not accidental. It was a studied commercial choice, and it made the Winchester Model 1873 nearly indispensable to settlers moving through territories where reliability and simplicity in the field were not preferences but necessities. The phrase that attached itself to the Model 1873 in the popular memory of the American West was a phrase the Winchester Repeating Arms Company had nothing to do with coining. People who carried the rifle gave it the name. They called it the gun that won the West. And the label persisted because it captured something about the rifle's reach, the degree to which its presence in a territory, in the hands of settlers and lawmen, and soldiers and everyone else who carried it, had shaped the terms by which that territory was being claimed. The term carried a pride that did not sit easily alongside everything the record established about what that claiming cost, and the distance between those two dimensions of the same history is not something that collapses easily in either direction. The rifle was what it was. The history it participated in was what it was. The records document both. What the Winchester Repeating Arms Company built in New Haven in the years after 1866 was not merely a profitable factory. It was a facility of sufficient industrial scale that it could supply rifles to settlers, to military forces, to law enforcement, and to individual buyers across a continent in volumes that sustained and deepened the commercial position established by the Henry's wartime reputation. The brick buildings along the New Haven waterfront, where Winchester rifles were produced, were substantial structures, the kind of architecture that announced permanence and institutional confidence. Inside them, in the 1870s and 1880s, workers assembled the lever action mechanisms that made the Model 1873 what it was: reliable, fast, familiar to anyone who had handled one before, and chambered in a round that had become something close to standard across the Western territories. The commercial logic was clean. The history the weapons participated in was considerably more complicated. The Winchester campaigns extended beyond the American West. Winchester rifles were sold to buyers across 2 continents in the decades following the company's reorganization, and the weapons moved through conflicts far outside the specific geography of the American frontier. The commercial reach of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company was, by the time Sarah Winchester found herself its principal heir, genuinely international. The weapons had been in use for long enough, across a wide enough geography, and in contexts varied enough that the total human cost of their deployment is not a figure that any single document captures. The records establish the commercial volumes. They document the military contracts. They note the international sales. What the rifle-by-rifle accounting of consequence would produce is a number the archives do not contain, and the history of the period does not resolve into a single clean sum. The scale of it is simply very large, and the New Haven factory kept running. By the time William Wirt Winchester died in March 1881, the company his family had built was producing rifles that were in active use across the American frontier, in the hands of various military forces, and in the possession of buyers from California to territories that would not become states for another decade. The estate he left was estimated at approximately $20 million. That figure, written in the documents of the period in the currency of 1881, requires a kind of translation before its weight becomes imaginable. $20 million in the early 1880s was not merely a large sum. It was a fortune of a magnitude that placed its holder in a specific category of American wealth, a category that carried with it access to resources, to influence, and to options that the vast majority of Americans of the period could not have conceived as available to a single individual. The Winchester Company itself had generated that fortune across the years since the Civil War, assembling it rifle by rifle, contract by contract, export order by export order. Alongside the estate came a nearly 50% ownership stake in the Winchester Repeating Arms Company itself. What that meant in practical terms was that Sarah Winchester did not simply inherit a fixed sum that would diminish as it was spent. She inherited a continuing position in a company that was still producing, still selling, still generating the commercial returns that had accumulated into the fortune in the first place. She was, at the time of her husband's death, approximately 41 years old, and she was by any reasonable measure one of the wealthiest women in the United States. The scale of that wealth did not resolve any of the things that the preceding months had taken from her, but it determined the material conditions under which everything that followed would occur, and in a very direct and practical sense, it made the Winchester Mystery House possible. The accounts that circulated in popular tellings of the Winchester story, accounts that were already being written down and repeated in the years following Sarah's death, described an income flowing to her from her Winchester stake at a rate of approximately $1,000 per day. The figure appeared in early biographical sketches of her life, in newspaper features, in the promotional materials that accompanied the house's opening as a tourist attraction in 1923, and in the popular histories that drew from all of these sources. As a figure, it was striking enough to be memorable and specific enough to seem authoritative. Whether it represented an accurate accounting of Sarah's actual daily income from dividends and royalties across all the years she spent in San Jose is a question the surviving financial records do not answer with the precision needed to confirm or contradict it cleanly. What the records do establish is that the construction she undertook over nearly 38 years, employing between 13 and 22 workers in around-the-clock shifts at wages appropriate to the period, required an income of substantial and reliable scale, and that scale was consistent with what a near-majority stake in a major American arms manufacturer would have generated across the same decades. $1,000 a day in the currency of the 1880s and 1890s is a figure that requires the same kind of translation as the $20 million estate. Converted to contemporary equivalents, it is a sum of more than $30,000 per day. Not a fortune generated by a single large event, but a fortune that arrived daily, that accumulated without requiring any particular action on Sarah's part, that was the product of factory floors in New Haven continuing to operate, of rifles continuing to be manufactured and sold, of the commercial machinery of the Winchester Company running along its established grooves, while simultaneously hammers were striking wood in the Santa Clara Valley of California. The two sites were connected by the flow of capital in a way that was entirely concrete. Workers in San Jose were paid with money that had been generated by workers in New Haven, and the chain of consequence between those two locations passed through the specific history of what Winchester rifles had been used for across the decades since the Civil War. The New Haven factory in the 1880s was a different facility from the one that had assembled Henry repeating rifles during the war, though it occupied the same industrial geography of the Connecticut city and drew on the same accumulated expertise. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company, by the mid-1880s, had grown beyond its wartime origins into a more diversified and more technically sophisticated manufacturer. New models had followed the 1873, each one an iteration on the lever action mechanism that had made the company's reputation, each one designed to address specific market preferences or to extend the range of buyers the company could reach. The industrial rhythm of the place, the assembly line processes, the quality control procedures, the shipping and distribution networks that moved completed rifles out through New Haven's port connections and railway linkages to buyers distributed across a very large geography, was the rhythm that generated the income arriving in San Jose. It was steady, it was reliable, it did not require Sarah's active management, and it continued across all the years she was building. The story of the Winchester fortune, traced from Oliver Winchester's reorganization of the New Haven Arms Company in 1866 to the estate Sarah inherited in 1881 and carried into California, is a story that runs through two of the largest events in 19th century American history. The Civil War and the violent settlement of the American West were not peripheral to the Winchester Company's commercial success. They were the conditions under which that success was achieved. The Henry Rifles battlefield performance created the commercial reputation. The Model 1873's practical interchangeability with the Colt revolver created the frontier market. The combination of those two moments of history and the company's ability to read both moments with commercial precision is what produced the fortune. The fortune is what produced the house. The house is the part of the story that has remained standing and accessible for a century, and it is the part that continues to draw visitors to San Jose. But the house did not arise from nothing. It arose from the specific financial conditions that the specific history of Winchester firearms had created, and those conditions had a texture and a weight that the architecture of the house in some sense contains, whether or not that containment was deliberate. Oliver Winchester himself died in December 1880, just months before his son William. The company he had built passed through a period of leadership transition, even as Sarah was processing the more personal loss of William's death in March 1881. The company continued. The rifles continued to be produced. The dividends and royalties that represented Sarah's share of the company's output continued to be generated and to flow toward her. None of the human events surrounding the Winchester family in those early 1880s interrupted the industrial processes that had been set in motion in New Haven in 1866. The factory had its own momentum, its own calendar, its own rhythm of production and distribution that was substantially independent of what happened to the individuals who owned it. That independence, the way the fortune persisted and generated itself, regardless of Sarah's grief, her decisions, her movements, is part of what defined the material situation she found herself in when she arrived in California in 1884. The Santa Clara Valley, into which Sarah arrived in 1884, was a flat, agricultural landscape of orchards and farmland, lying at some distance from the industrial and commercial centers she had known in the Northeast. San Jose was a growing city, but it was not New Haven, and the California that surrounded it bore almost no physical resemblance to the Connecticut world in which the Winchester fortune had been generated. Workers from the local area began arriving at the farmhouse she had purchased from Dr. Robert Caldwell, an 8-room structure sitting on 161 acres, and the first modifications and additions to the property began in the years immediately following her purchase. The income from New Haven was arriving. The construction was beginning. The distance between the California building site and the Connecticut factory was approximately 3,000 miles, and the money crossed it continuously. The Winchester Model 1873 was still in production in 1884 when Sarah arrived in the Santa Clara Valley. Workers in New Haven were still assembling the lever action mechanisms that had made the rifle's commercial reputation, and the rifles were still moving out through the distribution networks toward the Western territories, whose settlement they had in various ways supported and accelerated. The frontier that the Model 1873 had been named for, the one that the popular phrase called the West that the gun had won, was still being contested and transformed in 1884. The displacement of indigenous peoples that Winchester Firearms had contributed to was not a historical event in 1884. It was a continuing process, and the money it generated in New Haven was financing the construction of rooms and corridors and staircases in San Jose. The scale of the Winchester Company's output across the decades of its most productive period is documented in the production records and manufacturing histories that survived the various transitions of the company's long institutional life. The figures: 720,000 units of the Model 1873 alone, alongside the other models that the company produced in substantial volumes across the same period, are large enough that they resist being held as abstractions. They were individual objects, each one manufactured with care and precision, each one designed to function reliably and repeatedly, each one capable of what a lever-action repeating rifle is capable of in the hands of whoever carries it. The total of what those rifles did, across all the contexts in which they were used, is a sum that the production records do not calculate, and that no single archive fully contains. The production records count the objects. The historical record traces what some of them did. The gap between those two bodies of documentation is where much of the moral weight of the Winchester Company's legacy sits, quietly in documents that researchers have been working through for generations. What arrived daily in San Jose from that history was money, specifically the money that the company's ongoing operations generated, flowing through the financial arrangements that Sarah had inherited alongside her stake in the company. The workers she employed to build and modify and extend the farmhouse on its 161 acres were paid with that money. The timber they worked with was purchased with it. The hardware and the glass and the decorative materials that began appearing in the house as the construction grew in ambition and complexity, all of it was purchased with income generated by a factory in New Haven that made repeating rifles for a market that stretched from the American frontier to buyers on 2 continents. The financial chain connecting the Winchester Repeating Arms Company's factory floor to the construction site in San Jose was direct and continuous and uninterrupted across nearly 4 decades. And it is the chain that explains how a woman living alone in California managed to employ more than a dozen workers in round-the-clock construction for 38 years without ever apparently facing a shortage of funds sufficient to halt the work. The brick buildings of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company headquarters in New Haven in the 1880s were, in their way, as substantial and peculiar as anything being built in San Jose at the same time. They were the physical infrastructure of a major American manufacturer at the height of its commercial relevance, housing the processes that produced the most widely used repeating rifle in the American West. The smell of machine oil and metal that had characterized the factory floor in 1866 was still there in the 1880s and the 1890s. The sound of mechanisms being assembled was the same sound translated into newer models with refined tolerances and updated chambering. The workers who moved through those buildings were skilled tradespeople who understood the precise requirements of lever-action mechanism assembly, and they worked in shifts that kept production moving across the hours of the day. The parallel with what was happening in San Jose, workers moving through a building in shifts, construction proceeding around the clock, the rhythm of labor continuing without obvious interruption, is a structural similarity that the records document independently for each site without drawing the connection explicitly. The fortune that arrived in San Jose was not innocent of its origins, and it was not ignorant of them either, in the sense that the nature of the Winchester Company's business was not a secret available only to financial historians looking back from a later century. The rifles were sold openly. Their military applications were discussed in newspapers and government records. The campaigns of frontier settlement and indigenous displacement in which they were used were covered with varying degrees of candor and perspective in the press of the period. Sarah Winchester was an educated woman, documented as fluent in multiple languages, described by contemporaries as intellectually capable and socially engaged. And the business from which her income derived was the family business, known to her through the most intimate channels of domestic and social life. What she made of that knowledge, and whether the house in San Jose represented in any part a response to it, is a question that the documentary record does not answer, and that the house itself, in its silence, does not resolve. What the records do establish is this: the income arrived. The workers came each morning and each afternoon and each night because the construction ran continuously and the house grew through the addition of rooms and corridors and staircases and windows and doors at a rate that the daily income from New Haven made sustainable across nearly 4 decades. The farmhouse that had been 8 rooms in 1884 was something considerably larger and considerably stranger by the time that income and that labor had had their full run. The materials that went into it were high quality, The windows in some rooms were made by manufacturers whose work appeared in the finest domestic buildings of the period. The floors in certain areas were parquet. The construction, for all its anomalies, was not careless work. It was the product of skilled tradespeople working with good materials purchased with money that arrived reliably and in sufficient quantity to support whatever scale of ambition Sarah brought to the project each day. The approximately $1,000 per day that popular accounts attributed to Sarah's income, converted into the purchasing power of the contemporary moment, is a sum equivalent to something well above $30,000 in current terms, arriving each day, 7 days a week, without seasonal variation, without dependence on decisions Sarah needed to make or transactions she needed to execute. It arrived because the Winchester Repeating Arms Company continued to function. The company continued to function because the market for its products continued to exist. The market continued to exist because the processes of American frontier settlement and the international arms trade that Winchester supplied continued to require the kind of weapon the company produced. That chain of dependency between a specific commercial product, its specific historical applications, and the daily income that supported construction in the Santa Clara Valley runs through the Winchester House's entire history without ever quite surfacing in the popular telling of the story, which tends to focus on the staircase that ends at the ceiling and the door that opens onto empty air. Both the staircase and the story of how it was paid for are part of the same structure. The architecture could not have accumulated without the income. The income could not have been generated without the rifles. The rifles were what they were, documented in the production records of the New Haven factory and in the historical accounts of every conflict and settlement campaign they participated in. The morning that workers in San Jose drove the first new nail into the Caldwell farmhouse's wood, those connections were already in place, already generating the daily sum that would sustain the project across the years to come. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company in New Haven in the 1880s was sending a portion of its commercial output each day across approximately 3,000 miles to a woman who was building something in California that no one who worked in the factory had ever seen, and that very few people who knew Sarah personally had visited. The rifles moved out in one direction, toward buyers across the American West and beyond. The money moved in another direction, toward a building site where workers shaped wood and set glass and fitted hardware through the day and through the night. Both movements were steady, both were continuous, and the building that accumulated at one end of that long financial chain was, by the time the construction finally stopped in September 1922, something that the simple farmhouse of 1884 had given no indication it would become: a structure of approximately 160 rooms, 2,000 doors, 10,000 windows, and 47 fireplaces, sitting on land in the Santa Clara Valley, where hammers had sounded at 3 in the morning for nearly 4 decades, paid for with money generated by a factory that had been assembling lever-action repeating rifles since the year the Civil War ended. The daily income arrived. The hammers struck. The rooms accumulated. The rifles continued to be manufactured in New Haven, in the brick buildings that still stood along the Connecticut waterfront, through all the years that Sarah Winchester was building, and the money they generated continued to cross the continent to the Santa Clara Valley, where it was turned, day by day and week by week, into the house that stands today in San Jose. Its rooms and its anomalies and its open questions, all resting quietly on the particular financial foundation that the specific history of American arms manufacturing had laid beneath them. The switchback staircase begins at the floor and does not go far. 7 flights of pale wood, each flight brief, each step rising only 2 inches from the one before it. 44 steps in total, counting from the bottom landing to the top, and the whole structure climbs a vertical distance of approximately 9 feet, the height of a tall room, the height of a single man standing on the shoulders of another. That is all. 9 feet of vertical travel across 44 steps arranged in 7 flights, each flight turning back on itself before the climber has gone very far in any direction, the staircase folding and refolding through space the way a river doubles back across flat land. The geometry is correct. The arithmetic is correct. Every individual step is a step, every riser a riser, every tread wide enough to receive a foot and hold it. The wrongness is quiet. It is something the body registers before the mind catches up, a staircase that asks for effort in small increments, that seems always to be arriving somewhere, that delivers its climber 9 feet above where they began, after a journey that felt much longer than 9 feet warranted. Sarah Winchester ordered this staircase built. The date is not precisely documented, and the specific plans she may have drawn or approved for it have not survived, but the staircase itself survives, intact, and researchers who have examined it in the decades since the house was open to visitors have measured and confirmed its dimensions repeatedly. 2-inch risers, 44 steps, 7 flights, 9 feet. These are not approximations or tourist embellishments, but recorded physical facts, verified by architectural surveys conducted at various points across the 20th century, and preserved in the house's documentation. The staircase was built. It was built deliberately, and whoever built it well, because it is still standing more than a century later, its joints sound, its treads worn smooth by the feet of the workers who climbed it, and then by the feet of Sarah Winchester herself for the remaining years of her life, and then by the feet of everyone who has come since. One explanation that has followed the staircase through every retelling is Sarah's health. By the later years of her life, she was documented as suffering from arthritis, a condition that would have made the steep conventional risers of a standard Victorian staircase, typically between 7 and 8 inches, genuinely difficult to negotiate. A staircase with 2-inch risers would have been navigable even for joints that had stiffened and ached, each step a small commitment rather than a large one. The body asked for less and given more time between each demand. This is a practical explanation. It is the kind of explanation that resolves cleanly. A woman in pain, adapting her house to her body's needs across decades of construction, and architectural historians who have examined the Winchester House have noted it as a credible reading of the staircase's unusual form. The riser height could have been accommodation. The 7 flights could have been a consequence of the accommodation. The total structure could have emerged from need rather than from anything stranger than need. The difficulty with this explanation is not that it is wrong, but that it is incomplete in a particular way. There are other staircases in the Winchester House. The house at its height contained staircases of more conventional dimensions elsewhere in its interior, and researchers who have worked through what is known of the construction record have noted that Sarah did not make every staircase identical. The switchback staircase is the switchback staircase. Its 2-inch risers and its 7 folding flights are its own, and they have not been replicated in quite the same form elsewhere in the structure. This does not prove that the explanation fails. An unusual solution in one location does not preclude practical intent, but it keeps the question slightly open, which is where the question has remained for the better part of a century. The door is on the 2nd floor. It stands in a corridor alongside other doors, and it is finished the same way they are, the same woodwork, the same hardware, a working latch that turns and releases the door precisely as it should. Open it, and what arrives is not a room. What arrives is open air, California light, and a drop of somewhere between 10 and 15 feet to the garden below. No landing, no balcony rail, no staircase reaching up to meet a foot that might step through. The door opens outward onto nothing, and the garden sits at the bottom of the drop in ordinary morning stillness, and the door can be closed again and latched, and it becomes indistinguishable once more from every functioning door on either side of it. The California landmark documentation and the house's own architectural records confirm this feature. The drop is real, the door is real, the hardware functions. The practical explanation for doors like this one and the Winchester House contains more than one, though this is among the most documented, is that they were not doors to nowhere from the beginning, but doors to somewhere that no longer exists. As the house was built upward and outward across nearly 4 decades, the connections between its levels shifted. A door that once opened onto a balcony or a landing or an exterior stair might have found itself stranded as the structure around it changed, its destination demolished or rebuilt elsewhere, the door remaining because it was easier to leave a door in a wall than to remove it and repair the opening. This is plausible. Old houses in states of continuous renovation produce this kind of stranded architecture with some regularity. A fixed connection point outlasts the thing it was connected to, and the building moves on without fully accounting for what was left behind. What complicates this reading is the character of the Winchester House's construction overall, which does not easily suggest oversight or the accumulation of unconsidered remnants. The house was built to a standard that architectural historians have consistently noted as high. The parquet flooring in its interior rooms was documented as quality work by any measure of its period. The Tiffany art glass windows installed in several locations across the structure are among the more expensive decorative elements available to an American homeowner of the 1880s and 1890s, produced by one of the leading manufacturers of the era, fitted carefully into their openings and documented in the house's records with the specificity that expensive commissions attract. This was not a structure assembled carelessly. Things were not simply left behind because no one was paying attention. The workers who built the Winchester House were skilled. They were employed consistently across decades, and they were supervised. The door to the garden drop was not an accident left uncorrected. It was allowed to be what it is. The reason has not been established. Tiffany glass at 2 in the afternoon, in a room that has both a window onto the garden and a door that opens onto a wall. This is not a hypothetical pairing, but a documented condition of the Winchester House interior, where the highest quality ornamental work of the Gilded Age sits in rooms that also contain features no conventional architectural logic accounts for. The colored light from the art glass falls across the parquet floor in patterns that shift as the sun moves, the room filling with the amber and blue and green of leaded glass in afternoon light, and 12 feet away, a door is latched shut against a solid wall with no space behind it. Both things are real. Both were commissioned and constructed and are still present. The house holds them together without apparent anxiety, and the record of their coexistence, the craft and the anomaly, the beautiful and the inexplicable, is simply part of what the building is. There are rooms in the Winchester House where sound behaves differently. The observation is not new. Researchers and architectural historians examining the property across the last several decades have noted that certain rooms appear to have been designed with acoustic effects in mind, their proportions and the angles of their walls producing a gathering and clarifying effect on ambient sound that a conventionally shaped room does not produce. A voice across the room arrives more clearly than it should. A sound from outside the building enters the room slightly shaped by the geometry of the space, its character subtly altered. These are not dramatic effects. They are the kind of thing that a careful listener notices and then notices again, and that an acoustical engineer, examining the room's dimensions and wall angles, finds to correspond to deliberate rather than accidental causes. What makes this observation interesting within the context of the Winchester House is what it implies about intention. To build a room with deliberate acoustic properties is to have thought carefully about how sound moves through enclosed space. It is not a passive or accidental accomplishment. The angles must be calculated, the proportions considered, and the construction carried out with enough precision that the intended effect actually emerges in the finished room. Sarah Winchester had no formal training in architecture that has been documented, but she had resources, she had decades, she had a workforce of skilled builders, and she apparently had the capacity to direct construction at a level of specificity that produced effects in the finished work. The acoustic rooms suggest, to those researchers who have examined them most carefully, that some portion of the Winchester House's construction was genuine experimental inquiry into how space behaves, not spiritual compulsion, not psychological disarray, but something closer to a private and sustained investigation carried out in wood and plaster across the decades of a long widowhood in the Santa Clara Valley. The corridors are the part of the house that takes the longest to adjust to. A room with an unusual door or an acoustic anomaly presents itself as a room bounded, contained, legible as a space even if not as a purpose. A corridor asks the body to move through it, and in the Winchester House, some of the corridors resist the body's expectation of where they will go. A passage that appears to be heading toward the exterior wall of the building doubles back before it arrives there. A hallway of apparently normal proportions narrows at a specific point and then opens into a room that from outside would have seemed too far to reach from where the corridor began. The spatial logic of the house does not entirely conform to what a person who has not walked it before carries as their model of how an interior should be arranged. Researchers who have mapped the house in detail, and such maps exist, produced by architectural surveys conducted under conditions much more controlled than a visitor's walkthrough, confirm that the interior of the Winchester House is genuinely difficult to navigate without guidance, and not simply because it is large. The house at the height of its construction was 7 stories tall. The Queen Anne Tower, the most visible element of the roofline from across the flat Santa Clara Valley, rose above the surrounding agricultural land with a presence that visitors and neighbors noted in accounts from the period. From a distance, the building looked like what it was, a very large house in a state of continuous change, its silhouette not quite resolving into the familiar grammar of domestic architecture, its upper floors adding details that the lower floors didn't anticipate, the whole structure giving the impression of a building in conversation with itself. Workers were in the house at all hours. The accounts that have survived describe construction continuing through the night during the most active periods of the building's growth, lamplight visible from windows at hours when houses were dark, the sound of hammers audible to anyone passing along the road at 2 or 3 in the morning. Between 13 and 22 workers are documented as employed on the property at various points, and the pace of work they maintained across nearly 4 decades is the reason the 8-room farmhouse purchased in 1884 had become a structure of approximately 160 rooms by the time construction stopped. 160 rooms requires time to understand as a number. The farmhouse Sarah purchased had 8, The house she built around and above and beside it had 160. That transformation happened incrementally, room by room and floor by floor, across a period longer than most careers. And yet it was not a gradual process in the sense of being slow. It was continuous, which is different. A slow process allows for intervals of stillness. A continuous one does not. Workers arrived in the morning and left in the evening, and a night crew came after them, and every day for nearly 4 decades, the house was not the same house it had been the day before. Walls moved. Doorways were opened and sealed. Rooms that had been finished were modified. Staircases were built, and some of them were built again. The building was in a state that was not quite construction and not quite completion, but something that occupied the space between those two conditions permanently for the entire length of a human life. 2,000 doors are the figure that appears in the documentation. 10,000 windows, 47 fireplaces across the structure, some of them opening in the same room, on facing walls, some of them positioned where a fire, if lit, would send its smoke somewhere other than up a flue that could reach open air. These numbers have the quality that very large numbers sometimes have of becoming abstract before they finish arriving. 2,000 doors is a thing the mind accepts as a figure before it can quite become a thing the mind imagines. But 2,000 doors in a single house means a door every few steps through most of the building's interior. It means that the act of passing from one space to the next was in the Winchester House never a passage through open space, but always a passage through a door, always a small threshold, always the slight resistance and then release of a latch. The building divided its interior endlessly, and each division was a door, and each door was a frame, and each frame was another boundary between here and the next thing. Some of the fireplaces drew correctly and were functional in every conventional sense. Others were positioned in rooms where their flues had no clear path to the exterior, and researchers examining the construction history have not been able to establish whether these were built as genuine heating elements that were later rendered non-functional by changes to the structure around them, or whether they were built as fireplaces in form without the intention of being fireplaces in function. The distinction matters less than it might seem, because either reading produces the same question: why build a fireplace at all, if not for heat and light? And what purpose does a fireplace serve in a room where it cannot safely be lit? The answers that have been proposed are the same answers that follow all the Winchester House's anomalous features: spiritual symbolism, practical error, aesthetic repetition, experimental design, and none of them closes the question entirely. The windows are more straightforward, in the sense that most of them are functional as windows and admit light and wear operable air. What is less straightforward is their arrangement. Rooms that face the garden have windows. Rooms that have no exterior wall also have windows. Windows set into interior walls, looking from one interior space into another, admitting no natural light because there is no exterior source for them to draw from. These are real windows with real glass and real frames, and they look into other rooms the way exterior windows look into courtyards. And the Winchester House's interior is not entirely dark in the rooms that cannot reach an exterior wall, because some of them receive light that has passed through one or more intermediate windows before arriving. The light has traveled through rooms to get to them. It has crossed interior thresholds. By the time it reaches these deeper rooms, it is no longer quite the same light that entered the building from outside, having passed through glass once or twice before arriving, and the rooms it reaches have a quality of illumination that is indoor rather than outdoor, borrowed from the interior rather than drawn from the world beyond the wall. This quality of light, interior, indirect, having traveled to reach its destination, is one of the more quietly unusual features of the Winchester House's atmosphere. It is not a supernatural effect and requires no unusual explanation. Interior windows in large buildings are documented in various architectural traditions, often for ventilation or to allow light to penetrate building cores that cannot reach external walls. The Winchester House is large enough that its core cannot easily reach natural light without help, and interior windows are a solution to that practical problem. The fact that they are there is sensible. The effect they produce, rooms receiving light that is passed through other rooms, corridors lit by windows that look into other corridors, is simply a consequence of the solution working as it was designed to work. The atmosphere it creates is real and unusual, and it is the atmosphere of a building whose interior is in continuous conversation with itself. Spaces acknowledging other spaces through glass, the house lit from within by light that the house has passed between its own rooms. 47 fireplaces, 2,000 doors, 10,000 windows, 160 rooms, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, the switchback staircase with its 44 steps and its 7 flights and its 9 feet of vertical travel. The staircase is in many ways the most manageable of the house's anomalies, because it is a single object with documented dimensions and at least one credible practical explanation. It can be stood at and looked up, and the eye can follow its flights, each one turning back before it has gone very far. The geometry of it available to inspection in a way that a corridor's spatial logic or a fireplace flue arrangement is not. Visitors to the Winchester House have climbed this staircase since the 1920s, when the property was first opened to the public, and they climb it still. Each person's foot finds the same 2-inch rise, the same tread, the same slight sense of a staircase that is taking more time than it should to cover the distance it is covering. The experience is available every day. It has been available for a century. The parquet floors beneath the staircase and throughout much of the house's interior are in documented good condition in the sections of the building that received regular maintenance and were not sealed off after 1906. The quality of the woodwork, the pattern of the parquet, the joinery of the paneling in the rooms where Sarah apparently spent the most time reflects a consistent investment in craft that the house's construction records support. This was not a woman who spent her fortune indiscriminately on building without attention to what the building looked like when it was done. The aesthetic of the Winchester House, where it is visible in the documented and preserved sections, is a coherent one, high Victorian in its decorative impulses, quality conscious in its materials, and more refined in its finished surfaces than the house's reputation for architectural eccentricity might lead a visitor to expect. The anomalous features coexist with the refined ones. The door that opens onto the garden drop is hung in the same quality of woodwork as every other door in the corridor. The staircase with its 2-inch risers is a well-made staircase. Its joints sound, its surfaces finished, not a rough structure improvised without care. The Tiffany glass windows have been the subject of some of the more careful documentation in the house's preservation record. Several of them contain patterns that incorporate the number 13, 13 panes, 13 stones in a decorative motif, 13 sections of leading, and this has been noted in accounts of the house for as long as the property has been open to visitors. Whether the 13 was deliberate, and if so, what it was meant to mean, is a question the house's records do not answer. Sarah Winchester left no written explanation of her design choices in any document that has survived. Her surviving correspondence concerns domestic and business matters rather than the symbolism or intent of the house's construction. The Tiffany glass itself is documented, its manufacturer confirmed, its quality assessed by those who have examined it, and the pattern of 13s is present and countable. The intention behind the pattern is not established. There is a room in the Winchester House that researchers have described as the Seance Room. It has been called this since the early years of the house's public life, and the name has persisted in tour literature and popular accounts across the full century since the property opened. What the room actually is in the physical record is a small interior room, a room without exterior windows, reached through a door from a corridor, with certain acoustic properties that have been noted by those who have examined it. Whether it was used for seances, and whether Sarah Winchester conducted anything of that kind within its walls, is not established in any document that survives. The room's designation as a seance room appears to originate in the period following Sarah's death, when the property was being transformed into a visitor attraction, and the narrative of the house as a spiritualist project was being actively promoted. The room is real. The name is a later addition. The two things sit beside each other in the documentation, each authenticated as its own kind of fact. What the acoustic properties of rooms like this one actually demonstrate, and this is the observation that researchers committed to something other than the ghost. Narrative have found most worth returning to is that whoever designed them understood something about how sound moves through enclosed space. The Winchester House was built in an era before modern acoustic science had developed into a formal engineering discipline, but the principles that govern how sound reflects and gathers in a shaped room were not unknown to careful observers, and there is no particular reason why an intelligent and resourceful woman with decades of time, a large workforce, and an apparently genuine interest in what a building could do would not have found her way toward experiments in acoustic design. The seance room may have been designed to amplify and clarify sound for reasons entirely consistent with a natural curiosity about what particular geometries produce. It may have been designed for reasons that have nothing to do with what any current explanation proposes. The acoustic effect is documented. The intent is not. Running through the rooms at 3 a.m. in lamplight, a worker would have experienced the Winchester House as a place of constant becoming. A room that had been framed the week before would have walls by now. A staircase started in one part of the building would be connecting its second flight. Somewhere in the middle, floors a door would be hung in a frame that was ready for it, and somewhere else a window would be fitted into an opening that had been cut through an interior wall. The specific tasks changed night to night and year to year, but the condition was permanent. The house was always in the process of becoming something slightly different from what it had been, and the workers who moved through it in the dark carried that condition with them. Every nail they drove a contribution to a building that would look different in the morning from how it had looked the night before. 38 years of this, not continuously in the sense of every worker on every shift without exception, because the documentary record does not support quite that degree of absoluteness, but continuously in the broader sense, year after year, the workforce present, the construction ongoing, the house growing and changing through seasons and decades, without arriving at a point that Sarah Winchester declared finished. The growth was not random. New rooms were added in ways that required existing structures to be accounted for and worked around. Alterations to one part of the building had consequences for adjacent parts. The house developed, across its nearly 4 decades of construction, something like an internal logic, a set of conditions that each new addition had to negotiate, even if the logic was not the logic of conventional domestic architecture. Researchers who have studied the floor plans carefully have noted that the house makes a kind of sense on its own terms, that its corridors and rooms and staircases are not randomly distributed, but follow a pattern that was, at minimum, spatially considered, even where its purpose remains unknown. The seven-story tower was the tallest element of the house before the 1906 earthquake reduced its upper floors. From the flat Santa Clara Valley, the tower was visible at a distance, rising above the agricultural land and the lower roof lines of the house's sprawling wings. In the late afternoon, when the California light came in low from the west, the tower would have caught it high, while the valley below was already beginning to shade into evening. The top of the building lit, while its base sat in the advancing cool of the coming night. The workers who were on site at dusk would have seen this effect regularly across the years of the house's growth, the tower above them still in the last of the light, the rooms they were working in already dim enough to need a lamp. The building occupied two conditions of light simultaneously, which is perhaps a small way of saying something about what the building did more generally. It held more than one thing at once, without resolving them. In the decades since the Winchester House became a public site, since it was designated a California Historical Landmark in 1974 and added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1981, the building has been studied more carefully than its popular reputation as a ghost house might suggest. Architectural surveys have measured its dimensions and documented its features with precision. Preservation records track the condition of its materials over time. Researchers working outside the frame of its tourist narrative have looked at the construction history with the kind of attention that the primary documentary record allows, and what they have found consistently is a building of genuine interest to anyone willing to approach it without the ghost story and without the dismissal that the ghost story sometimes provokes. The Winchester House is more interesting than its legend, in the same way that most things that have developed legends are more interesting than their legends. The legend is a simplification, and simplifications are always less than what they simplify. The switchback staircase receives several hundred visitors on a typical day. They approach it from the corridor, and they stand at its base for a moment, looking up at the first flight, and then they begin to climb. The 2-inch risers ask very little of any individual step, and when the foot goes up a small distance and finds the tread, and the next step is another small distance, and the next, and the flight turns before it has gone far, and the next flight begins, and it too turns, and 7 flights later, the staircase delivers its climber 9 feet above the floor they started from. The time it has taken feels slightly longer than 9 feet should require. The staircase has done its particular thing, whatever that thing is: practical accommodation, architectural experiment, spiritualist instruction, or something else entirely that no current explanation accounts for. The staircase has done it for every climber who has stood at its base and looked up across more than a century, and it will continue to do it for as long as it stands. The Winchester House at dusk, in the years before 1906, when the tower still rose to its full 7 stories, would have been visible from some distance across the valley floor as the last light caught its upper windows. The Queen Anne Tower, its silhouette not quite like any of the other buildings visible from the road, standing in the last of the afternoon, while the flatland below it darkened into evening, the house containing within it, at that hour, the parquet floors and the Tiffany glass and the acoustic rooms and the door that opened onto the garden drop and the 44 steps of the switchback staircase and the 10,000 windows and the 2,000 doors, all of it accumulating in the dark while the tower above held the light a few minutes longer. 38 years of construction quietly accumulated in the rooms below, their features documented, their purposes largely unresolved, the building itself still standing and still holding its questions with the particular patience of a thing that has simply continued to exist across a very long time. In a well-appointed parlor somewhere in New York or Boston or Philadelphia, on an evening in the 1880s, a medium's voice settled into the candlelit air of a room crowded with people who had come not out of desperation, but out of a kind of socially sanctioned hope. The chairs were good ones. The wallpaper was recent. The guests had arrived in carriages and were dressed in the considered manner of people who kept accounts with the better establishments in their cities. What they were doing, sitting with their hands on a table, waiting for a knock or a voice or a shift in the quality of the air, was not fringe behavior. It was not a sign of instability or of credulity running past its reasonable limits. It was, in the 1880s, one of the more ordinary ways a certain kind of person might spend a Thursday evening. The Fox sisters had changed the cultural landscape of American spiritual life when they first reported hearing unexplained rapping sounds in their Hydesville, New York farmhouse in 1848. Whether their claims were genuine or were later confessed to be a fabrication, the movement they catalyzed did not depend on whether the sisters themselves were telling the truth. By the 1880s, spiritualism, the belief that the living and the dead could communicate, that mediums with particular sensitivities could serve as conduits between the two states, had acquired millions of adherents across the United States and Europe. The movement had its own newspapers, its own lecture circuits, its own internal debates about credentialing and fraud. Mary Todd Lincoln had reportedly held seances in the White House following the death of her son Willie in 1862. Queen Victoria was said to have consulted a medium after Prince Albert died. These were not the behaviors of the culturally marginal. They were the behaviors of people at the center of their worlds who had encountered grief and were reaching toward whatever their era made available. That context matters because any assessment of Sarah Winchester's reported consultation with a medium in the early 1880s has to rest inside it. The spiritualist movement was not a subculture she would have had to seek out. It was the ambient air of Gilded Age middle and upper-class American life, available at social gatherings and spiritualist societies in every major city, promoted in publications read by exactly the kind of educated, prosperous New Englander she had spent her life being. If she had consulted a medium following the deaths of her daughter and her husband, and the historical record on this point is genuinely uncertain, she would have been doing something that thousands of women in identical social positions were also doing in the same decade. A medium named Adam Coons appears in the popular telling of Sarah's story as the figure who changed everything. In the most widely repeated version of the account, this medium told Sarah that her family had been targeted by the spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles, and that in order to appease them, she must travel west and build ceaselessly, that construction must never stop, that the moment building halted, the spirits would collect what they were owed. The narrative is specific and vivid and has been repeated in countless accounts of the house. It names a cause and provides a purpose that transforms Sarah Winchester from a grieving widow making unconventional choices into something more legible to a popular audience, a woman driven by supernatural instruction, building against her own death, constructing a fortress of corridors and misdirection to confuse the dead who wanted her. The difficulty is that historian Robert Svihus and other researchers who have worked carefully through the primary documentary record have found no credible contemporary evidence supporting this account. Svihus has examined the contemporaneous newspaper coverage of Sarah's life and the house she was building, has worked through the letters and business records and legal documents that survive from her lifetime and has found no reference in any document produced while Sarah was alive to medium instructions, to ghost appeasement, to the Adam Coons consultation, to any spiritual compulsion driving the construction. The story does not appear in her correspondence. It does not appear in interviews with the workers who built the house over nearly 4 decades. It does not appear in any account by anyone who had direct contact with Sarah during her years in San Jose. The story appears, instead, in the promotional materials that followed her death. John and Mamie Brown opened the house to paying visitors in 1923, a year after Sarah died, and the tourism operation needed a story. What they had was already remarkable: a vast, strange, labyrinthine house that had been built continuously for 38 years by a wealthy widow who had never explained herself publicly. That house needed a framework that would draw visitors from across California and beyond, a narrative thread that would give the rooms and stairs and doors their necessary meaning. The ghost narrative was available. It was culturally resonant. It transformed each architectural anomaly, every staircase that climbed toward a ceiling, every door that opened onto open air, into evidence of spiritual desperation. Each strange feature a mark left by compulsion rather than a choice made for reasons that might have been entirely practical or entirely private, or both. The narrative was, in short, good for business, and it has remained good for business across the century since the house first opened its doors to curious strangers. The Winchester Mystery House's own tourism materials continue to present the spirit-driven building account as the central explanation for the house's unusual architecture. The brochures and the guided tours and the website all carry some version of the story. The house itself promotes it, and that matters because the popular understanding of what the Winchester House is and why it was built has been shaped not primarily by historical research, but by the promotional needs of a tourist attraction operating from 1923 to the present day. This is not an unusual circumstance. Many historical sites have their interpretive layers deposited across them by the commercial operations that make their preservation financially viable. The Winchester House is not unique in having its story shaped by those who had an interest in making it a certain kind of story. It is only unusually transparent about the fact, once examined, none of this resolves the question of what was actually driving the construction. The absence of evidence for the medium narrative does not mean the construction was not spiritually motivated. Absence is not disproof. What Civius and researchers working the documentary record have established is not that Sarah Winchester was definitely not acting out of spiritual belief, but that the specific story attached to her in the popular telling, the medium, the instruction, the ceaseless building as appeasement, cannot be verified from the documents. The building continued for 38 years. That is not in dispute. The reasons it continued remain genuinely open. One framework that researchers have proposed sits not in the realm of spirits, but in the realm of bereavement. Sarah Winchester lost her only child at 40 days old. She lost her husband when she was in her early 40s. She was left childless, widowed, and enormously wealthy in a social world that offered women of her era very few sanctioned avenues for sustained public purpose. She could not run a business in any conventional sense. She could not enter a profession. She could not take on a formal public role. What she could do, what the scale of her inheritance made practically possible, was build. Construction is daily decision-making. It is the exercise of aesthetic judgment and practical authority across hundreds of small choices every day. It requires the management of a workforce, the approval of plans, the examination of materials, the adjudication of competing proposals. It produces something visible and tangible at the end of each working day. It does not allow for extended periods of stillness. Bereavement researchers and psychologists examining the Winchester case have proposed that the construction project may have functioned as something like a prolonged grief response, a structure external to the self, a container for the daily energy that grief leaves with no direction. The work would have provided routine and forward motion in their most literal forms. The house was always unfinished. There was always something to decide. For a woman with no children, no professional outlet, and no surviving immediate family, the presence of workers arriving each morning with questions to answer may have been something close to necessary. This is not a clinical diagnosis of any pathology. The bereavement researchers who have raised this hypothesis are not arguing that Sarah was mentally unwell. They are proposing that she found, in the particular resource of a vast income and a property in need of constant expansion, something that functioned as purpose, which is exactly what grief requires and what her social circumstances otherwise denied her. That hypothesis carries its own difficulties. It does not account for the specific and unusual character of some of the architectural choices. If the construction was primarily about the provision of daily structure, why the acoustic rooms? Why the doors to open air? Why the stairs climbing to sealed ceilings? A grief response that expressed itself as straightforward expansion, more rooms, more wings, the ordinary additions of a large house growing larger, would provide the same daily structure as construction that produced architectural features no one has yet fully explained. The bereavement framework accounts for the duration and the relentlessness of the building, but it does not account for its specific character. It answers one layer of the question and leaves another layer entirely intact. The Gilded Age context sits underneath all of the explanations in ways that are easy to underestimate. Sarah Winchester was a woman of extraordinary education and evident intellectual capacity, living in an era when women of her class were expected to occupy a very narrow social band. She spoke multiple languages. She had been educated well beyond what was conventional for women of her time. She had managed enormous practical complexity in running the construction operation at the Winchester property for nearly 4 decades. These are not the attributes of someone who simply received instructions and followed them without reflection. Whatever drove the construction, whether it had spiritual dimensions, whether it was a grief response, whether it was a form of design experimentation, whether it was some combination of all three, it is worth holding the intelligence of the person at the center of it when assessing what she was likely to have been doing. The architectural experimentation hypothesis rests on documented evidence from the building itself. Sarah incorporated high-quality materials throughout the house: parquet flooring, Tiffany art glass windows from manufacturers who were then at the forefront of American decorative arts, hardware and millwork of the best available standard. The presence of these materials suggests that aesthetic judgment was being actively exercised across the construction, that the person directing the work was attending to quality and to the sensory experience of rooms rather than simply adding square footage in a compulsive way. Architectural historians who have examined the house have also documented acoustic features, rooms and corridors whose geometry appears designed to direct and amplify sound in specific ways. These features represent a kind of experimental inquiry into the acoustic behavior of enclosed space. Whether this inquiry was practical, aesthetic, or had some dimension that the documentary record does not capture is itself unresolved. But the features are there, documented in the physical structure of the building, and they suggest deliberate design intelligence at work. The acoustic rooms are interesting in a particular way because they place Sarah Winchester not in the category of a compulsive builder following irrational imperatives, but in the category of someone conducting genuine experiments in what a building can do. Acoustic experimentation in residential architecture was not common in the 1880s and 1890s. The science of architectural acoustics was still being developed. Wallace Clement Sabane's foundational work in the field would not be published until the very end of the 19th century. If Sarah was building rooms with deliberate acoustic geometries before that work was widely disseminated, she was working ahead of what was formally established. That is a different kind of building project than either the compulsion narrative or the simple grief response hypothesis allows for. It places her inside something more like a genuine research project, conducted in the materials of wood and plaster and glass, rather than in the pages of a journal. What cannot be established from the documentary record is how the different elements related to each other in Sarah's own understanding of what she was doing. The acoustic rooms, and the Tiffany windows, and the stairs of shallow risers, and the doors opening onto open air may all belong to a single coherent project whose logic remains undiscovered. They may represent different phases of something that evolved across 4 decades. They may represent genuinely separate impulses operating in the same building without a unifying scheme. Sarah Winchester did not leave a journal that has been recovered. She did not give interviews that survive. She did not correspond with architects or theorists about her work in ways that have been found. The most intimate evidence available about what she was doing is the building itself, and the building as a document is not easy to read. There is a version of the story that holds all of these frameworks at once without collapsing into any of them. A grieving woman, deeply educated, of unusual intellectual capacity, with resources that removed every practical limit on her ambitions. In an era when spiritualism was the ordinary language of a certain kind of educated grief, purchasing a small, unfinished farmhouse and beginning to add to it with a daily regularity that the rest of her life did not otherwise provide. Some of her building decisions may have been spiritually motivated, not in the specific externally directed way the ghost narrative proposes, but in the more private way that someone with her losses and her era's spiritual vocabulary might have made room in an ongoing construction project for intentions that were not primarily structural. Some of her building decisions were clearly aesthetic. Some were experimental. Some may have been practical in ways that her arthritis, her privacy concerns, and her personal habits of movement through her own house would explain. The house may have been all of these things simultaneously, held together by the coherence of one person's daily attention, rather than by any single explanatory scheme. The spiritualist movement, for its part, asks something of its adherents that is easy to miss in hindsight. It did not ask them to believe in ghosts in the crude popular sense. At its most intellectually serious, and by the 1880s it had produced substantial serious literature, it asked them to consider that consciousness might persist beyond physical death in some form, that the universe was larger than materialist science had established, that communication across the boundary of death was possible under conditions that remained imperfectly understood. These were questions that serious intellectuals of the period, including William James and Arthur Conan Doyle, engaged with at length and without dismissing. For a woman who had lost a child and a husband within 15 years of each other, the questions the spiritualist movement was working on were not abstract ones. They were the most personally urgent questions available. That she may have engaged with them in private ways the documentary record did not capture seems entirely within the range of what the historical evidence permits without establishing. The workers who built the house for nearly 4 decades had their own impressions, some of which survived in later interviews and accounts. They described Sarah as a careful and exacting employer, one who reviewed plans attentively and made changes that were sometimes costly and inconvenient, but that she insisted on nevertheless. They did not describe someone in the grip of irrational compulsion. They described someone who knew what she wanted and could communicate it clearly, who kept the work orderly and moving forward, who paid well and expected quality. The workforce on the property at its peak included skilled craftsmen, carpenters, glaziers, plumbers, stonemasons, whose presence implies a construction project with genuine design ambitions rather than a merely continuous one. The workers' accounts, such as they are, do not support the extreme version of the compulsion narrative. They do not resolve the question of why the building took the specific forms it did, but they describe a building environment with ordinary professional rhythms, not the atmosphere of spiritual emergency that the popular story implies. The number 13 appears throughout the house with a frequency that has attracted comment. 13 steps in certain staircases, 13 windows in certain rooms, 13 hooks in closets, 13 palms along a particular stretch of the driveway. The popular accounts have offered this repetition as evidence of spiritual preoccupation. Some researchers have proposed instead that 13 was simply a number Sarah favored, a personal preference absorbed into the ongoing design decisions of a building project she controlled entirely. Others have noted that in certain traditions, 13 carried positive rather than negative associations. None of these explanations is established. The 13s are documented in the house. What they meant to Sarah, if they meant anything beyond an aesthetic preference, cannot be determined from the available record. The question of privacy is worth pausing on because it sits underneath several of the competing explanations in a way that doesn't receive enough attention. Sarah Winchester's years in San Jose were years of extensive and sometimes unwelcome public attention. Her wealth made her a local figure of considerable interest. The house itself attracted curiosity. People would seek to tour it, to photograph it, to report on it in the local press. Sarah was, by all accounts, a deeply private person who did not welcome scrutiny and who had designed her daily life around avoiding it. The architectural complexity of the house, the disorienting layout, the false doors, the corridors that doubled back would have made the property substantially harder to navigate for anyone who was not Sarah or one of her trusted staff. A house that is very difficult to move through quickly is a house that protects its occupant from unwanted guests in a practical and immediate way. The privacy explanation does not account for all of the unusual features, but it accounts for some of them more simply than any spiritual interpretation. In the documentary record, Sarah Winchester's own voice is almost entirely absent. She gave no lengthy interviews. Her letters, where they survive, are largely practical, about construction details, about business matters, about the household's management. She did not articulate a philosophy of building. She did not explain herself to the journalists who wrote about her during her lifetime. She left behind an absence at the center of her story that every interpreter has filled with whatever material their own interests and needs supplied. The ghost narrative filled it with spirits. The bereavement hypothesis filled it with grief in need of structure. The architectural experimentation hypothesis filled it with intellectual ambition. None of them filled it with her actual words, because her actual words on these subjects do not appear to have been recorded. That absence is, in its own way, the most accurate thing about her. It is not a gap in the historical record in the usual sense, a document that burned, an archive that was lost. It appears to have been a deliberate condition of her life. Sarah Winchester chose, across nearly 4 decades in San Jose, not to explain herself. The construction continued. The rooms accumulated. The unusual features were built and built again, and the woman directing all of it from somewhere inside that vast, growing, labyrinthine house did not leave a public account of her intentions. Whatever she was not doing it for an audience. The house was built by a woman who kept her reasons to herself, and the house is what remains. There is something in that particular corridor, the one whose walls are angled at calculations that have not been matched to any standard architectural principle, where the sound of the space arrives at the ear slightly differently than ordinary corridors produce. Researchers who have documented this feature have proposed their explanations for it: spiritual intention, acoustic experimentation, the coincidental geometry of a building designed without formal architectural training. None of the proposals has closed the question. The corridor stands. The angles are what they are. The sound behaves as it behaves. The documentation of the feature exists in the physical record of the building, and the document it produces cannot yet be read. All of the explanations for the Winchester House share one quality. They are each more legible than the alternative they are explaining away. The ghost narrative is legible. The grief response is legible. The design experimentation is legible. They each offer a framework in which the unusual features of the building resolve into something understandable, a cause, a need, a purpose that organizes the strangeness into coherence. What none of them can fully provide is access to the interior of a very private woman's understanding of what she was doing across 38 years in a California farmhouse that grew under her direction into something no one has yet entirely explained. The angled walls of the acoustic corridor stand in the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose. Their geometry patient and exact, the sound inside them shaped by calculations whose purpose the documentary record does not record. The room is real. The feature is documented. The question it poses has not been formally resolved. In the body of evidence that surrounds the Winchester House, the construction records, the worker accounts, the historical research, the tourism materials, the architectural assessments, that corridor sits as the clearest image of what the whole enterprise finally is: something built by a specific and intelligent person for reasons that have not been established, and that continues to hold those reasons with the quiet physical permanence of walls that simply do not explain themselves. At approximately 5 minutes past 5 on the morning of April 18, 1906, the Santa Clara Valley was dark and still. The Winchester Mansion sat on its grounds in San Jose, as it had sat for more than 2 decades, layered, improbable, its 7-story Queen Anne Tower rising above the surrounding flat land in a silhouette that had become simply part of the valley's geography. Unremarkable, only because it had been standing long enough that people had stopped seeing it as strange. The workers who would arrive later that morning had not yet come. The house held its rooms in the pre-dawn quiet. All those corridors and sealed passages and stairways folded into darkness, the valley outside still and cool, in the way that April mornings in California can be, carrying a particular quality of calm that belongs to the hour just before the world resumes. The earthquake arrived at 5:12. What reached the Santa Clara Valley from the San Andreas Fault that morning was the traveling edge of a rupture that had begun somewhere to the northwest, along a fault line running hundreds of miles through the coastal range, and the shaking it produced when it arrived at the Winchester property was sufficient to bring the top 3 floors of the 7-story tower down onto themselves. The Queen Anne Tower, which had taken years to build and had become the most visible feature of Sarah Winchester's continuously expanding structure, lost its upper portion in the seconds that the ground moved. 3 floors descended. The silhouette that had stood above the valley changed shape permanently in less time than it takes to understand what is happening. Inside the house, in the room known as the Daisy Bedroom, Sarah Winchester was trapped by the movement of walls and the settling of debris, unable to reach the door until workers arrived and made their way to her. She was 66 years old. The shaking lasted less than a minute. The damage it left behind would define the remaining 16 years of the house's construction and Sarah's occupation of it. The hours after the earthquake were hours of assessment. Workers moved through the house, identifying what had shifted, what had cracked, what had collapsed entirely. The front portion of the mansion had sustained particular damage, and Sarah made a decision in the days that followed that has since become one of the more quietly striking details of the house's history. Rather than restore the damaged rooms at the front of the structure, she had them boarded over, approximately 30 rooms sealed behind planking, removed from the house's active interior while construction continued elsewhere on the property. The decision itself was documented, and its practical dimensions are straightforward enough. Earthquake damage requires resources, and Sarah may have chosen to redirect those resources toward the portions of the house still under active development. The sealed rooms were not demolished. They were not rebuilt. They were simply closed off, a section of the house placed in suspension while the rest of it continued to grow in other directions. Those 30 rooms remained sealed for the rest of Sarah's life. When investigators and new occupants eventually entered them after her death in 1922, they found what had been left there on the April morning of the earthquake: construction materials laid out for work that was never resumed, partially completed features, artifacts of daily household use in positions suggesting simple interruption rather than deliberate arrangement. A room that had been in the middle of becoming something had stayed that way for 16 years. The calendar in those sealed spaces had stopped in April 1906, and everything inside them had simply remained where it was, undisturbed, while outside, in the rest of the mansion, the hammers continued, the workers continued, and Sarah continued to live and build and direct. It is worth sitting with the specific quality of that image for a moment, not for what it suggests about grief or compulsion or spiritual belief, but simply for what it is as a physical fact. 30 rooms in suspension, 16 years of construction proceeding around them, the boarded walls standing within a house that was still growing outward and upward in other directions, the sealed interior like a held breath inside a body, still in motion. The house after 1906 was a different structure than it had been before, smaller at its top, quieter in its front section, the tower reduced to 4 stories from 7, its most dramatic vertical feature permanently altered. Sarah had the damaged stairways and passages in the affected areas sealed rather than reopened. The shape of daily movement through the house changed. Where she had previously moved through one set of corridors, she now moved through others. The house reorganized itself around what had happened, the way a river reorganizes around an obstruction, finding new channels, new routes, the current continuing. Construction did not stop after the earthquake. That is perhaps the clearest single fact about Sarah Winchester's relationship to the building process, that even a seismic event sufficient to reduce 3 floors of her tower to rubble did not produce more than a brief interruption in the work. Carpenters and laborers continued to arrive. New rooms continued to be added. New windows, new passageways, new features were incorporated into the structure Year after year, through the first decade of the 20th century and into the second, the house that emerged from the post-earthquake years was not the house that had existed before April 18th, 1906, but it was recognizably continuous with it. The same accumulated strangeness, the same coexistence of sophisticated aesthetic choices and anomalous structural decisions, the same daily presence of workers moving through lamplight from one partially finished room to the next. Sarah Winchester, in the years between the earthquake and her death in 1922, was increasingly limited in her mobility by arthritis. She moved through the house differently than she once had, and some researchers have proposed that certain features of the post-earthquake construction reflect this changed mobility, modifications designed to accommodate the specific difficulty of her movement rather than to satisfy aesthetic preference or spiritual directive. Wider doorways in some sections, gradual transitions between levels, the lowered risers of the switchback staircase, which had been part of the house long before the earthquake, but which may always have been designed with the needs of someone for whom conventional stairs were painful to negotiate. These are proposals rather than conclusions. The documentary record does not contain Sarah's own account of why she built, as she did. What it contains is the building itself, still standing, still embodying decisions whose rationale she took with her. She died on September 5th, 1922, heart failure at age 83. The cause was documented, the date was documented, and what happened immediately after her death was documented by those who were present in the house in the days that followed. Construction stopped across the property. Workers who had arrived for their shifts were informed of what had happened and set down their tools. In some areas of the house, the state in which they left their work was preserved long enough to be observed and recorded by those who came through later. Nails driven only partway into wood, their heads still above the surface, the hammer blow that would have finished them never delivered. Boards laid into position, but not yet fastened. Lumber cut and measured, but left in place, not yet fitted to its intended location. The interrupted quality of the work was not universal across the house, but it was present in enough locations to become part of the documented record, a detail that has since attached itself to the Winchester story in the way that certain details do, small, specific, and quietly resistant to being forgotten. The house sat with this quality of interrupted labor through the autumn of 1922 and into the following year. Sarah's estate required time to settle. The contents of the house, furniture, glass, fixtures, the accumulated material of 38 years of sophisticated domestic acquisition, were cataloged and dispersed through an estate auction that took 6 weeks to complete. Tiffany art glass windows, which Sarah had ordered from leading manufacturers during the decades of construction, moved out through the doors of the Winchester mansion and into the hands of collectors and dealers across the western United States. Victorian furnishings that had occupied rooms in the interior of the house were carried out and loaded and driven away to other destinations. The house was not emptied quickly. 6 weeks of auction, items leaving through the same doors they had entered through, the building gradually becoming less furnished, less occupied, more itself in the specific way that a structure becomes itself when the life being lived inside it is withdrawn. John and Mamie Brown leased the property in 1923 and began admitting paying visitors. The decision about how to present the house to those visitors was made early and has shaped the Winchester story in ways that remain active to the present day. The language the Browns chose for their promotion of the property was the language of haunting and spiritualist obsession, Sarah Winchester building ceaselessly on the instructions of a medium, the spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles, requiring continuous architectural appeasement. The house a monument to grief and supernatural compulsion. This framing was effective as a commercial proposition. It gave visitors a narrative framework within which the anomalous features of the house became legible, even satisfying. The staircase to nowhere made sense. If Sarah had been directed to build it by forces unconcerned with practical utility, the door opening onto air made sense if the spirits moving through the house needed passage that human architecture couldn't anticipate. The house offered genuine strangeness. The narrative the Browns applied to it organized that strangeness into a story that paying visitors in 1923 could follow. What the narrative did not include, because it could not include what was not available, was any authenticated first-person account from Sarah Winchester herself. No letter has surfaced in which she describes receiving instructions from a medium. No diary entry has been found in which she connects specific architectural features to spiritual direction. No contemporaneous newspaper account from the decades of her construction documents. Her describing her motivations in the terms that the tourist literature of 1923 and afterward would use to characterize them. Researchers examining the primary documentary record, the contemporaneous accounts, the newspaper coverage, the records produced during Sarah's lifetime, have worked through this material without finding the foundation that the popular narrative assumes. What they have found is a woman building, for decades, with evident seriousness and considerable resources, in ways that sometimes followed conventional practice and sometimes departed from it in ways that have not been satisfactorily explained. The explanation offered by the tourist brochure is one available explanation. The documentary record does not confirm it, but neither does it offer a replacement that accounts for everything the house contains. The Winchester Mystery House was designated California Historical Landmark, number 868, in 1974. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1981. These designations recognize the house not as a monument to the supernatural, but as a place of genuine historical significance, as an artifact of Gilded Age wealth and eccentricity, as an example of Queen Anne architecture in a modified and extended form, as the documented product of nearly 4 decades of continuous construction, supervised by one of the wealthiest women in late 19th century America. The designations did not resolve the questions the house raises about why it was built as it was. They place those questions within a formal frame of historical and cultural preservation, acknowledging that whatever the house is, it is worth keeping. The building deserved to continue standing. It has continued to stand. Approximately 165,000 visitors walk through the Winchester Mystery House each year. They enter through doors that still function on their original hardware. They move through corridors that have been walked continuously since the early years of the 20th century, the flooring worn by the passage of feet over more than 100 years of daily use. They climb the switchback staircase, all 7 flights of it, all 44 steps, each riser measuring 2 inches in height, the whole structure ascending 9 feet of vertical distance across a span that takes much longer to climb than 9 feet ought to suggest. The staircase is not roped off. It is part of the tour. Visitors climb it in groups, their footsteps on the pale wood producing the particular sound that footsteps on old wooden stairs produce. And at the top they are in a corridor that was built around them by workers who have been dead for a century. And the staircase is still quietly wrong, in exactly the same way it has always been quietly wrong, and no one has yet produced an explanation of its construction that the documentary record fully supports. Among the things visitors to the house report and have reported consistently in accounts collected over the centuries since the house opened to the public are unexplained sounds in specific areas of the building, knocking sounds without apparent source, temperature variations in corridors that differ from the ambient temperature of adjacent spaces in ways that HVAC systems do not fully account for, visual impressions in doorways and at the edges of passages of something present that is not present when looked at directly. These reports cluster geographically in ways that the house's management has documented over time, and the switchback staircase area appears with particular frequency in the accounts. The management presents these reports as visitor accounts. This is the accurate and honest framing. They are reports of experiences, documented as such, held at the appropriate distance of things observed by witnesses, and recorded but not verified by any investigative process that would allow a stronger characterization. They have continued arriving for 100 years. That persistence is itself a documented fact about the house, separate from the question of what the experiences described in the reports actually represent. The cold spots where they are reported occur in corridors that were built according to specifications Sarah Winchester directed. The specifications she directed were not random. She was a woman of education and evident aesthetic sophistication who incorporated Tiffany glass and parquet, flooring, and acoustic design features into a structure that also contains a staircase, climbing to a ceiling, and a door opening onto a drop. Whatever she was doing it deliberately and with the resources of one of the largest personal fortunes in the late 19th century United States, applied continuously for 38 years to a project whose documentation does not explain the project. The cold spots are in corridors that were built to a plan. What the plan was serving is the question the house keeps holding and has held through the century of visitors and researchers and tourism materials and historical designations. Without arriving at an answer, the available evidence fully supports. The boarded rooms that Sarah sealed after the 1906 earthquake were eventually opened after her death. What was found inside them has been described in accounts that have themselves become part of the house's documentary record. The suspended state of the interior, the materials left in place, the quality of a space preserved against the forward movement of time. The rooms are accessible to visitors now in certain parts of the tour, their walls still carrying the evidence of what they were and what happened to them and the long interval during which they were held closed. A room that was in the middle of becoming something and then was not, and then was held that way for 16 years, has a specific quality that is difficult to describe and easy to recognize when standing inside it. The Winchester House contains several such spaces. With this, their documentation is part of the house's record. Their effect on the people who walk through them is part of the visitor accounts. The space between those two things, the documented physical fact and the experienced quality of the place, is where most of the Winchester Mystery House's genuine interest lives. Sarah Winchester was born in 1839 and died in 1922. The house she built between 1884 and 1922 still stands on its land in San Jose. In the 83 years of her life, she moved from New Haven to the Santa Clara Valley, from a social world of Gilded Age Connecticut to the flat agricultural land of California, from a farmhouse of 8 rooms to a mansion of approximately 160, from a life that had included a husband and a child to a life that had lost them both and found in the ongoing work of building something that occupied the mornings and the afternoons and, according to some accounts, the nights as well. What she found in the building, what it gave her, what she was looking for, what she believed about the project she was engaged in, is not documented in any source that historians have so far been able to verify. The house is the only document she left that is large enough to enter. The Queen Anne Tower, rebuilt to 4 stories after the earthquake brought 3 floors down in 1906, stands above the roofline of the surrounding structure at a height diminished from what it once was. Before April 18, 1906, it rose 7 stories above the Santa Clara Valley and could be seen from considerable distances across the flat land, a vertical feature in a horizontal landscape, marking the location of something unusual at its base. After the earthquake, it was shorter and has remained shorter since. The tour groups climbing the switchback staircase pass beneath the rebuilt tower in a corridor that was constructed after the earthquake, part of the reorganized routing that the damaged and sealed sections of the house required. The tower above them is not the tower that Sarah built. It is the tower that survived what the earthquake left behind, and that has continued to stand above the valley in that reduced form for more than 100 years. The house has been studied. Architectural historians have walked its corridors and measured its rooms and documented its features and proposed their explanations. Psychologists and bereavement researchers have examined the construction record and offered their interpretations. Researchers working in the primary documentary archive have read the contemporaneous accounts and found what the accounts do and do not support. Tour guides have walked thousands of visitors through the anomalous passages and the functional rooms and the sealed spaces and the acoustic chambers and the staircase that arrives at a ceiling, and those visitors have left carrying whatever the house gave them: a story, a question, an experience in the cold spot of a particular corridor, an image they find themselves returning to later. None of the study has resolved the central questions the house raises. The questions are not smaller for having been examined carefully. They have remained the size they were when the house was first described in public accounts following Sarah's death, and in some ways they are larger now because they have been examined carefully and have not diminished. What it was for Sarah Winchester to walk through her own house late at night is not known. There are no journals. The letters that survive are documented, but limited in what they reveal about her inner life. She moved through rooms she had ordered built, along corridors she had directed, past windows she had selected, up and down staircases whose particular geometry was the result of plans she had approved. Whether she found the house comforting or disorienting, or simply familiar in the way that any inhabited space becomes familiar over decades of daily occupancy, is not something the record establishes. What the record establishes is that she lived in the house for 38 years, and that she continued to modify and extend it throughout those years, and that when she died on September 5th, 1922, the construction stopped because she had been the reason it continued. And without her direction, there was nothing for the workers to do but set down their tools and leave the nails half driven in the wood. The estate auction of autumn 1922, the 6 weeks of dispersal, the Tiffany glass moving out through the doors, the Victorian furnishings following, left the house standing on its grounds in San Jose in a state it had not occupied before. Furnished and occupied for 38 years, then emptied over 6 weeks, the rooms that had held the daily texture of Sarah's life becoming bare in a gradual process that took longer than anyone who had not thought about the volume of contents involved might have expected. A house of approximately 160 rooms accumulates. What accumulates over 38 years in 160 rooms takes 6 weeks to remove. At the end of those 6 weeks, the house was what it remains: a structure, a documented artifact, a set of corridors and rooms and staircases and windows holding the shapes that Sarah directed them to hold, waiting for the visitors who would begin arriving in 1923 and have not stopped arriving since. The world Sarah Winchester had come from, the New Haven of the 1860s and 1870s, the Gilded Age social world that had shaped her education and her marriage and her standing, was a world that had, by 1922, changed beyond easy recognition. The Civil War was more than 50 years past. The frontier that the Winchester rifle had accompanied across the American West was formally closed in the historical accounting before the century turned. The spiritualist movement that had flourished in the 1880s had contracted, its mainstream respectability diminished by the exposure of prominent fraudulent mediums and by the cultural shifts of the early 20th century. Sarah had outlived the particular world in which the Winchester story began, had continued building through the decades as that world changed around her, and had died in a California that was not quite the California she had arrived in on the train from the Northeast in 1884. The house was older than most of the buildings surrounding it. It had been growing since before most of the people in San Jose in 1922 were born. She left no children. The child she had, Annie Pardee Winchester, born in 1866, had lived 40 days. What remained of Sarah Winchester's continuation in the world was the house itself, the documented record of its construction, and the questions the construction raises that the documentary record does not answer. These are not small remainders. The house stands in San Jose as a California historical landmark and a listing on the National Register of Historic Places, and a destination for approximately 165,000 people each year, and it has stood in those conditions for more than a century, accumulating visits and reports and examinations and proposed explanations, and none of the explanations have been sufficient to make the strangeness go away. The strangeness has persisted. It has persisted with the particular patience of things built to last, the patience of parquet flooring and Tiffany glass and 2-inch risers on 44 steps, climbing 9 feet of vertical distance in 7 flights of pale wood. The switchback staircase is still there. This is perhaps the simplest and most sufficient thing to say about it. Every day that the Winchester Mystery House is open, visitors climb those 44 steps, and the geometry of the thing is still wrong in exactly the same way it was wrong when Sarah Winchester was alive to direct its construction, and no one has arrived at an explanation of why it was built that way that can be confirmed by the documentary record. The wrongness and the explanation that makes sense of the wrongness have coexisted in the Winchester Mystery House for more than 100 years now, without resolving into each other, the open question remaining open, the staircase remaining the staircase. The 2-inch risers carrying weight each day in San Jose, just as they have carried weight since the day they were built. There are 165,000 visitors a year. They climb the staircase. They stand in the room with the Tiffany window and look at the colored light falling across the parquet floor. They look through the door that opens onto air. They walk the acoustic corridor where sound arrives, shaped differently than it does in a conventionally built hallway. They move through the sealed rooms that have been unsealed, through the corridors that were modified after the earthquake, through the spaces that Sarah Winchester directed to be built, and that were built, and that have simply continued to stand in their improbable configuration through the decades. Each of those 165,000 visitors carries the house away, in some form, the image of the staircase, the memory of the door, the particular quality of a cold spot in a corridor that was built to a plan the plan's author never explained. The house distributes itself through those carried images across the world outside San Jose, while the building itself stays on its land, holding its rooms in whatever relationship they hold to each other. The tower standing above the roofline in the diminished form it has had, since the morning of April 18th, 1906. It is a real place. The designation on the National Register of Historic Places is a real designation. The parquet flooring is real flooring, and the Tiffany glass is real glass. And the 44 steps of the switchback staircase are real wood, and the 2-inch risers are real dimensions that someone measured and cut and assembled under Sarah Winchester's direction in a real building that still stands on real ground in San Jose, California. The questions are real questions